Magna Carta. We've all heard of it, and most of us have a pretty good idea what it was, who signed it, where, and possibly even when. But when we get to questions like, why was it signed? How did it help to shape the world we know today? And what on earth does it have to do with this man? We're probably on less certain ground. In fact, we might be in danger of coming over as a bunch of ignorant peasants, in which case we wouldn't look too out of place if we went on holiday to England in 1215. The setting for the king's demons, and for the signing of one of history's most famous documents. So to answer our why question, let's have a look at the sort of country we'd find there if we did.
It's a country that's been at war effectively for the past 60 years. And John is the third of the so-called Angevin kings. They come from Anjou in France, and they think of England and being king of England really as a resource to pursue conflict, and England is a money pot.
The early 13th century was a period of increasing population, of expanding trade, of strong central government, which was supported by an efficient royal administration.
Increasing trade, a country perpetually at war, and a strong central government. This doesn't sound too unlike the England of the very early 21st century so far, but the similarities end there.
13th century English society was hierarchical, with the king at the top. Leading barons, themselves major landholders, owed the king military service, that is, supplying knights when the king required them in return for these lands. The baron distributed their land between their own tenants, the knights, who paid for their manors by fighting at their lord's side. At the bottom of the pile were the peasants who lived on these manors. They received land and protection and justice from their lords in return for cultivating their lords' fields, so that their lords wouldn't have to get their hands dirty.
In any pre-industrial society, 90% of the population worked the land, and on the surplus of their labour lived the kind of elite 10%. So the vast majority of the population, of whom we have almost no evidence, are there day in, day out, trying to scratch something from the soil.
So if we could pay a visit to England in 1215 and live the life of a peasant, it's likely we want it to be a fairly short visit, of a few hours maybe.
It's a relentless enterprise, made worse by the fact that you've got a lord who's looking to cream off the top. So you have to grow to kind of survive, and keep your own family going, but you know that you have to grow extra because the lord's going to come round collecting.
But what would life feel like at the top of the social pyramid? What would life have felt like for King John? Perhaps one word can sum it up: difficult.
Enough!
A word that also describes the act he had to follow when he became king.
Richard was John's elder brother. He had died in 1199 from a crossbow wound whilst trying to recover some of his French lands. Unlike John, Richard's medieval reputation was unassailable. He was one of the most glamorous monarchs of the period. He was a famous crusader who amassed a huge army to recover Jerusalem from Egyptian forces under Saladin. To medieval minds, that was the noblest ideal. Richard embraced it with alacrity. He was not only a great commander, a logistician, a strategist, he was also a great and brave warrior who led his men from the front.
So how well did John rise to the challenge of filling his brother's boots?
By 1215, at the end of his reign, his relationship with his barons deteriorated into civil war. The French were poised for conquest, and his unnatural success in making enemies resulted in John's almost unretrievably bad reputation.
It seems then that John didn't quite have his brother's knack for winning people over. But was he really the cruel and greedy villain of popular mythology?
John's reputation as personally deplorable, greedy, and worthless as a king was the product of medieval monastic chroniclers who saw his reign as an unmitigated disaster.
He's not as hated or as regarded as a bad king as he is in later mythology. I mean, certainly the Victorians regard him as the, quote, the worst of all of our kings. At the time, the assessment is much more equivocal. He doesn't stand out in contemporary eyes as the worst king they've ever had.
In fact, whilst John's reign may have been a train wreck, he was a conscientious judge, a careful administrator, a man of culture, and an energetic ruler. He was decisive in his military actions, often outmanoeuvring his enemies. He built up the English navy. He attended assiduously to the business of government.
So how did John end up making an enemy of virtually everyone by 1215? Let's look at some of the other forces at play in the world at that time and his relationships with them. First of all, the middle layer of the English social pyramid, the people who were creaming off the peasant surplus.
In theory, all kings needed the barons. These men were all landholders with extensive estates, men who had an important stake in the way that the kingdom was run.
You are welcome at Fitzwilliam Castle.
So perhaps being a baron would be the best way to spend a brief holiday in early 13th century England, because it wouldn't be in anyone's interest to upset you. If a peasant annoyed you, you could beat him and throw him off your land. If the king wanted to achieve anything, he needed your support. John mostly wanted support in giving the King of France a bloody nose.
It was a military society which, if not actually engaged in war, was always prepared for it. The knights, who held land on the barons' estates and accompanied them in their military retinues, were mounted warriors. These military aristocrats generally lived in castles and spent much of their time hunting and engaged in tournaments, both of which prepared young knights for the battlefield.
Then, as now, if you did want to spend most of your time fighting, it helped if you weren't short of a bob or two.
Kings like Richard and John required huge financial resources to run their kingdom. The revenue of the crown was derived from its position as supreme overlord at the top of the hierarchy. For example, if a baron died without an heir, the king would seize his estates and take their revenues until the heir reached the age of majority.
This system seems hard on the barons, and we might feel sorry for them, if we didn't already know how much they'd been exploiting and oppressing our ancestors. It wasn't the system itself that turned them against John, though. After all, he only inherited it.
All of the Norman and Angevin kings, especially the virtuous and saintly Richard, had used these royal privileges to raise money, in Richard's case, to pay for his crusading adventures.
I wish that I were a hawk, sire, and Saladin my prey.
Now there's a subject for our troubadours and actors.
It was just that John did it better. John, more than his brother, refined the existing royal administration systems to rule. He personally supervised the work of the Exchequer. His chief justices rode around the kingdom with him, hearing pleas from his subjects. He, like his brother, also allowed people to buy their jobs in the royal administration rather than appointing the best man for the job. Thus, some of his officials were indeed corrupt and ignorant of the law.
If you do have a talent for getting on the wrong side of people, then what better way to display it than by annoying the world's most powerful man? In the narrow society of 13th century Europe, this meant a certain person in Rome with a very special hotline.
1215 is a huge year for the history of the church. There's a big council held in Rome, the Fourth Lateran Council so-called, where 600 bishops come. They're summoned by the Pope, Pope Innocent III, and he is, you could say, the most successful ruler in Western Europe of all kinds at this point. It's the culmination of kind of 150 years period during which the church has really got itself together as an organisation. The church is doing well at this point.
In 1205, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Hubert Walter, died. Although appointed to the post by King Richard, it was he who sowed the seeds of John's spat with the church. The problem was he was a man with two jobs.
Main thing about Hubert Walter is he's also Richard's chancellor. And when he dies, the monks of Canterbury say that, okay, fine, he's gone. He spent too much time doing king's business, spending time on money. He left all these bad debts. There's all these grievances they have. They want someone who's going to be more focused on doing the job as they see it, being a pastor. They make their case to Rome. John makes his case. The Pope sides with the monks of Canterbury, crudely speaking, and tries to appoint a man called Stephen Langton. That's not John's candidate, and there's a standoff between the two of them that lasts really for several years.
Having failed to get his way with Walter's successor, Pope Innocent decided to turn the screws on John.
The first thing he does is to lay on England a so-called interdict. The point of that is to say that no one can get married or baptised officially. There's a kind of blackout on everything that priests would normally do for people in England. When that doesn't work, he says, right, John, I'm going to excommunicate you.
In the fervently Christian world of 13th century Europe, excommunication was the Pope's nuclear option.
The excommunication, it makes John toxic. Anyone who associates with John is also effectively out of the Christian community. And at that point, he's a poisonous person. And it has a serious effect.
Exiled from the Christian communion, John suffered a reverse that appeared to confirm his status as the subject of divine displeasure.
Where it really starts to go wrong for John is the Battle of Bouvines on Sunday, July 27th in 1214, it's a big battle. John's not even there. He's hundreds of miles further south, but his generals are there, his allies are there, and he loses to the King of France. And it's like England losing to Croatia. They are out of Europe. And for medieval people, if you lose a battle, it's a sign that God has voted against you. You are a cosmic loser. And at that point, his political credit, which has been on the line, really ebbs away.
Just as King Richard had found that being a brilliant soldier and the darling of the church did no harm for his domestic credibility, John now found that being the exact opposite achieved the exact opposite.
The barons in England, his leading councillors, decide, well, basically enough is enough. They gather in the north in early 1215 and start to move south, and it's clear that he's got a revolt on his hand at home. And that leads to the big meeting in the middle of the year in London.
The barons were welcomed into London by the city's equally aggrieved inhabitants in mid-May 1215. Following a tense 3-week standoff, the rebels and the king finally met to iron out their differences on the field of Runnymede on the banks of the River Thames on June the 15th. Here, John reluctantly agreed to have his future behaviour bound by a written agreement.
What they are basically demanding of John is that he make his behaviour predictable. He's granted any number of privileges to particular groups of barons. What changes in 1215 is that, no, we need something in writing that applies to all of us. We'd like to define what you can and can't do. If you don't, we'll withdraw our allegiance altogether.
Medieval kings were thought to have a special relationship with God. The agreement forced on their king by the barons indicates the extent to which that relationship was thought, in John's case, to have broken down.
It was a king under pressure. It's rather like a prime minister dealing with rebellious backbenchers. Until 1215, really, there'd been this concept of the divine right of kings, that the powers of the king came from God. If the king was a bad king, his punishment would be not on earth, but in the afterlife. The barons took rather a different view, and he started pinching their lands.
John was only a reluctant signatory to the agreement that the Royal Chancery made official on July the 15th, 1215.
Magna Carta was a short-term solution to a political problem. It wasn't meant to be the foundation stone of parliamentary democracy or anything so grand. It was a question, really, of the king preventing a complete loss of control. He was giving up some of his powers rather than risk losing all of them. And, as they say, Magna Carta was extracted from the king at the point of a sword.
So, if Magna Carta didn't guarantee fundamental freedoms and rights for all people, and didn't seek to enshrine constitutional law, what exactly did it say?
Magna Carta, so Latin Magna, Great, Carta, Charter. A charter is a gift, it's a document recording a gift, and the Great Charter records the gift of the king to his leading subjects of a number of liberties.
The 62 clauses of the Magna Carta were in themselves nothing revolutionary. They were a practical assertion of existing law and custom that imposed limitations on the arbitrary power of the crown. The Magna Carta managed to define the relationship between the king and his barons more precisely. Many of its clauses limited the amounts the king could take from his barons, as for example in scutage. Others limited the power of the royal officials and bailiffs. They needed to have knowledge of the law and observe it well.
Others, it's fair to say, are hilariously to us specific. There shall be no fish traps on the Thames. That's in the Magna Carta, and it stays in the Magna Carta in all its subsequent versions.
Perhaps most importantly, the Charter also reinforced the tenets of medieval common law. It was addressed to all the free men of the realm, which excluded a large proportion of the population.
We shouldn't get the idea that it's a series of great constitutional principles. It's a series of very specific grievances and very specific liberties, i.e. privileges, which are granted.
If the barons saw Magna Carta as a short-term solution to an immediate problem, John's perspective was even more short-term. Once the barons had left London, he renounced the agreement, plunging England into a civil war which ended when the king died of dysentery on October the 18th, 1216. But it wasn't easy for his successors to restore the monarchy to its previous position of unrivaled supremacy. Magna Carta just wouldn't go away.
It's reissued in 1216 after John's death, in 1217, in 1225, so 3 times in the next 10 years, confirmed in 1237, confirmed again in 1253 and in 1297. So it becomes a point of reference for the rest of the century. But they don't see it as a holy writ. They're happy to take it as a starting point that can be, you know, drafted, redrafted, amended. The status that it has is it's a point of reference on which everyone can agree. OK, we all agree there should be a great charter. What it should contain is something that each generation will work out for itself.
These reissues also firmed up the details that the original 1215 charter had left imprecise.
Although the tradition of reaffirming Magna Carta had been established, it still wasn't technically law. That changed at the end of the 13th century in events reminiscent of its beginning.
What happens in 1297 is, I mean, the king at this point is Edward I. There's another argument about how much money the king can legitimately take from his subjects. It's confirmed in Parliament. And the fact that that's the first time, as I understand it, it's been confirmed in the court, because Parliament is not how we think of it today. It's an official court. So at that point, if you like, it passes into statute law.
Over the next 6 centuries, power in England moved increasingly away from the monarchy towards Parliament. During that time, Parliament became representative of an increasingly large cross-section of English society. There was more protection in law from the whims and ambitions of the powerful and influential.
It does become a key point of reference through the 13th century into the 14th century, the key developments in the 1330s, when, for example, the clause about trial by one's peers, that's spelled out as being trial by jury, which is not clear until that point.
The charter has been used and interpreted throughout history by people for their own ends.
If you take something like Shakespeare's King John, so end of the 16th century, Magna Carta is not even mentioned, not important. In the 17th century, under the Stuarts, lawyers, in particular Edward Coke, start to go to town on Magna Carta and to really make it the cornerstone of an argument about how English law has always said this, this and this. It says so in Magna Carta, therefore you, the Stuarts, need to play by these rules.
For English radicals in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Charter's liberties were the birthrights of all free Englishmen.
If the British were happy to use the Charter to advance the cause of their own liberties, they weren't quite as keen to see it used in support of the freedoms of others. This was particularly so when those others had had the cheek to defeat them in war and steal a large part of their empire.
In America, its principles were seen as affirming individuals' rights against all forms of authority.
Magna Carta was cited by everybody in the States as the foundation stone of this new country they wanted to create, this new democratic republic. The recognition of Magna Carta in the United States is far stronger than it is here in the UK. And it was embodied in the Bill of Rights in the United States, almost word for word. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution draws so heavily on the language even of Magna Carta. 500 years later, you talk to an American lawmaker, Magna Carta is for them the wellspring of all their freedoms. And if you go into the Supreme Court in Washington, the first thing you see is a frieze of great lawmakers, Napoleon, a former Supreme Court justice, and King John holding Magna Carta.
King John as a champion of constitutional law? Who says Americans don't appreciate irony?
The United Kingdom doesn't have a written constitution. We've had Magna Carta now for almost 800 years, and that one clause really has been the foundation stone of an awful lot of our parliamentary activity, and particularly judicial activity.
The clause in question is responsible for one of the key differences we'd noticed between 13th and 21st century England on returning from our little medieval holiday. If you were unlucky enough to be a medieval English peasant, then pretty much anyone with nice clothes, a horse and a castle could push you around. Today, everyone is protected by the law.
Well, this concept of habeas corpus, which is that you're innocent until proven guilty, you cannot be detained without being charged and in due course tried, is fundamental. It's fundamental in the civilised world.
As you settle back into the freedoms of 21st century life, you might reflect on how lucky you are to be living at the end of the process that gave you those freedoms. If so, you might be surprised to learn that some believe that the process has not ended, but has gone into reverse. They could probably pin the start of that reversal to a very specific day. The terror attacks on New York's World Trade Center on September the 11th, 2001, allegedly masterminded by Osama bin Laden, caused the governments of the US and the UK to declare a war on terror.
The judiciary in the United States is allowing a presidential executive power to imprison people in Guantanamo Bay, in Cuba, without trial. Quite routinely, people are being tortured, detained for years, without any charge being brought against them. Now that is completely in opposition to the principles of Magna Carta and the rule of law. It's arbitrary power being exercised by an executive authority. It's the opposite of Magna Carta, and it's the opposite of the Bill of Rights.
In attempting to protect ancient rights, new legislations were sought.
If you think about the debate here in the UK about 42 days detention without charge, you think of Guantanamo Bay, you think of extraordinary rendition, for heaven's sake. This is about pulling out the foundation stone of the rule of law and democracy. And if you pull out the foundation stone, the whole edifice comes down with it.